Hello and welcome to Asia Newsweek. I'm Yvonne Yong. I'll take you through the top stories in the region and to go beyond the headlines for a deeper look at what's happening in Asia. Our top story, somewhat frosty relations between China and India appear to be warming up. Leaders Xi Jinping and NarendraModi have held an official meeting while in Russia for the BRICS summit. It comes just days after the two nuclear powers struck a deal to resolve a 4-year military standoff on their disputed Himalayan border. Well, for more, let's talk to East Asia Correspondent Kathleen Calderwood. Kathleen, how significant is this meeting between Xi Jinping and NarendraModi?
Well, Yvonne, there's really been a couple of positive developments in China-India relations just in a matter of days. It, of course, began early in the week with the announcement from the Indian Foreign Minister that they had reached an agreement with the Chinese over patrols in this disputed Himalayan border area. Now, it's not an actual resolution of the border dispute, but it is an agreement that will de-escalate tensions in an area where there's been at least around 24 soldiers, mostly Indian, killed in violent clashes since 2020. And then that was followed, of course, by this first official bilateral meeting in about 5 years between Narendra Modi and Xi Jinping on the sidelines of the BRICS summit. So while it might not be a complete reset of the relationship, it certainly does signal friendlier ties. Both leaders talked about the need for for more peaceful, resolutions between the two neighbouring countries. And it may signal also some more opportunities for economic and business opportunities there between China and India too.
And of course, the two leaders took part in the actual BRICS summit. The fact that Vladimir Putin was not only at the meeting in person this year, but hosted it, how significant was that?
Look, it's really hugely significant because people might remember that last year Vladimir Putin attended this summit virtually, and that's because South Africa, as a signatory to the International Criminal Court, would have been obliged to arrest him. That court, of course, has a warrant out for Vladimir Putin, accusing him of being responsible for the war crime of transporting children from Ukraine to Russia. So he decided it was too hard and too risky, of course, to go to South Africa for the meeting this year. But of course, now he's hosting it. And this is really giving him a moment to really show the West that he's not as isolated as they might like, that he, he has all these world leaders coming to Russia, talking about some of the things that he'd like to see happen, some of which would have a dampening effect on those Western-led sanctions. The other significant attendee, of course, was the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. Now, Ukraine lashed Antonio Guterres for accepting the invitation to attend this summit, but he of course did take the opportunity to address the countries and the leaders gathered, and during that address he did speak about the need for peace in the Middle East, but of course also in Ukraine, and he spoke about the need for a just peace in Ukraine that aligns with international law and the UN Charter.
Kathleen, thanks for that update. The US has confirmed there is evidence there are North Korean troops in Russia and says at least 3,000 troops have already been deployed. It builds on claims by both Ukraine and South Korea that Pyongyang has agreed to send up to 12,000 troops to fight on the battlefield. North Asia correspondent James Oaten filed this report on Tuesday.
3 people were killed and more than a dozen injured as Russian ballistic missiles struck the southern Ukrainian city of Zaporizhia.
It was horrible. I thought the house was going to completely collapse, but thank God it didn't.
US Defence Secretary Lloyd Austin is in the capital pledging more aid and criticising North Korea reportedly sending troops to fight alongside Russia.
We must continue to squarely face the spectre of an aggressive Russia, backed by other autocrats from North Korea and Iran.
Footage released online purports to show North Korean troops being given Russian gear and uniforms. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky is calling on allies to step up sanctions on Moscow.
We need decisive actions from our partners, especially in light of reports about North Korea's new role in supporting Russia.
South Korea wants the UN to order their immediate withdrawal and warns Pyongyang will want something in return. According to Seoul's spy agency, North Korea has already shipped around 1,500 Special Forces troops to Russia's Far East for training. It estimates around 12,000 soldiers will eventually help Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The Kremlin says Moscow has the right to cooperate with its neighbour.
North Korea will expect a generous payoff from Moscow in return for its troop contribution. It could be either military or financial assistance. It could be nuclear weapons-related technology.
Russia's already relying on North Korea to replenish artillery shells. Now it's using them for another dwindling resource: manpower. James Oaten, ABC News.
Authorities in the Philippines are continuing a massive rescue effort after a deadly tropical storm left dozens of people dead and thousands stranded. Widespread flooding and landslides swept away cars and prompted authorities to scramble for motorboats to rescue trapped villagers. Storm Trami brought winds of up to 160 kilometres an hour when it made landfall. Authorities expect the death toll to continue to rise as they attempt to reach villages that have been isolated by fallen debris. A new political era has begun in Indonesia, with PrabowoSubianto sworn in as president. The 73-year-old takes the helm of Southeast Asia's largest nation, pledging to make it an economic powerhouse. From Jakarta, here's Indonesia correspondent Bill Birtles.
Akan memenuhi kewajiban Presiden Republik Indonesia.
This moment was decades in the making. PrabowoSubianto has long sought the country's top job. Now, this blue blood of Indonesian political and military circles has promised to rule for the country's most vulnerable.
Kita harus mengerti selalu.
A free nation is a nation where the people are free. People need to be free from fear, poverty, hunger, lack of education, oppression and suffering.
The former general was ousted from the military once over brutal tactics against opponents of his then father-in-law, the dictator Suharto. Prabowo was later reborn as a perennial presidential candidate. With the backing of his former rival, the popular outgoing president JokoWidodo, he won a landslide election victory earlier this year. He's expected to have a bigger voice on the world stage than his predecessor.
We have to show solidarity. We must defend all the oppressed people in the world. That's why we support freedom for Palestinians.
The beginning of the Prabowo era marks the end of a decade of JokoWidodo, but the outgoing leader won't be far from the centre of power. His son, Gibran Rakabuming Raka, is the new vice president. At 37, he's seen as a sign of continuity and a symbol of how his father will continue to have influence behind the scenes. Bill Birtles, ABC News, Jakarta.
Well, let's take a look at some headlines now. Vietnam has sworn in its new president, Luong Kong, after months of political turmoil. It's hoped the Army General will bring some stability after a turbulent phase of reshuffles amid an anti-corruption campaign. The 67-year-old replaces To Lam, who remained as president even after he was appointed to the most powerful position as Communist Party chief. To Lam will now focus on the top job, while Luong Kong will serve in a largely ceremonial role, forging ties with the international community. Hundreds of protesters have tried to storm the presidential palace in Bangladesh over comments made by the president about the disgraced former prime minister. People gathered at the palace and chanted slogans outside military barricades. Later, they clashed with police who used stun grenades when demonstrators tried to get through security barriers. The unrest began after President Mohammed Shahbuddin gave an interview where he implied former Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina may not have resigned before fleeing the country. Sheikh Hasina is currently in India, having left the office after weeks of deadly protests. An arrest warrant has been issued by a Bangladesh court for her alleged involvement in crimes against humanity. Well, we asked Professor Sriradha Datta from the Jindal School of International Affairs, what is the likelihood of India extraditing the 77-year-old?
A simple answer to that would be a no. But we must try and understand that in any extradition request, there is always a very intricate technical process involved, a judicial process involved. Also, as you know, in any extradition treaty, there's a caveat about political considerations. So if the Indian government feels that this has not been done in good faith and there are, prejudices against her, even on grounds like that, it could be refused. But I do not see a situation where the demand is, request comes up and India giving into it right away. I think there's a very complicated, complex process involved.
Japan heads to the polls this weekend for a snap general election. It's a major test for the new Prime Minister, Shigeru Ishiba, who has been in the job just shy of 1 month. While the ruling party is likely to stay in power, it's expected to lose dozens of seats amid a string of scandals and a public dealing with cost of living pressures.
Shigeru Ishiba was confirmed as Prime Minister just 3 weeks ago. So will his decision to call a snap election pay off? He was chosen to lead the Liberal Democratic Party, or LDP, after the previous PM stepped down. First entering Parliament in 1986, Mr Ishiba has been angling for the top job for years. But he's taken over at a fraught time, after a string of public scandals that damaged public trust in his party.
It's the slush fund scandal. Only a few politicians are honest and fair. I want them to serve as statesmen.
Honestly, my impression of the LDP isn't that good. I don't think they're being honest and upfront about everything, so I don't really believe them. I can't trust them completely.
The leader of the Constitutional Democratic Party, Yoshihiko Noda, will be looking to capitalise on that sentiment. He's also served a stint as Prime Minister for another party back in 2011. But just like Mr Ishiba, he's new to this leadership role, having been appointed a few days after his opponent. His party is not expected to win. The LDP's coalition has held power in Japan for most of the post-war period. But it could pick up some of the dozens of seats the LDP is projected to lose. The Liberal Democratic Party needs 233 seats out of the lower house's 465 to hold a majority. Before Parliament was dissolved, it had 257. But polls are suggesting it could lose as many as 50 seats, meaning it would have to rely on its coalition partner, Komeito, to maintain its majority. So what else is on voters' minds this time around?
I hope the government can take measures to solve the economic problems. Due to the depreciation of the Japanese yen, our economy is indeed weak at present. So what I'm most looking forward to is the new government taking action on the economy.
People should elect candidates who can empathise with them about surging prices and how people are suffering.
Even Japan's iconic ramen shops aren't immune from the economic pain, being forced to raise the prices of a traditionally cheap comfort food.
It's difficult to say what kind of economic measures are needed. But for example, having subsidies would be a feasible plan to support us. Or having a plan to reduce utility costs for restaurants would be nice too.
Shigeru Ishiba will be looking for a mandate to cement his leadership, but a weak result for the LDP on Sunday might spell trouble for the party and its power in Parliament.
The younger son of the late Lee Kuan Yew, who founded Singapore, has been granted asylum in the UK. Lee Hsien Loong claims he has been persecuted in his own country amid a long-standing family feud. Since the death of their father, the younger Lee and his sister, who recently passed away, have been in a public dispute over the family home with older brother Lee Hsien Loong, who served as Prime Minister for 20 years. Well, he's now claiming to be a political refugee, which is pretty significant. While Singapore's government says Mr. Lee is free to return home, it's not clear if he would ever be able to leave if he did.
Lee Hsien Loong is free to return to Singapore in the same way as a mouse is free to walk into the cat's cradle. If he came in, once he's in, he'd never get out again. He'd be placing himself at the power of the state being wielded by the other member of the family. And that's as simple as that. And interestingly, it remains to be seen whether now that there's a new Prime Minister, Lee Hsien Loong is no longer Prime Minister, whether anything has changed. And I suspect it hasn't.
In Malaysia, a proposed bill that would give more powers to a mufti or Islamic jurist in certain parts of the country is stoking fears among the nation's Muslims. It's controversial because it would allow the mufti to propose a fatwa or religious ruling to the king and have it made into law without the need for a debate in Parliament. Under Article 11 of the bill, the fatwa would apply to all Muslims who reside in federal territories, which includes the capital, Kuala Lumpur. But these rulings would not be applied to non-Muslims. Human rights activist and lawyer Latifa Koya says the MuftiBill circumvents the nation's parliament and infringes on personal freedoms.
It is unlike the legislation. We're talking about a mufti who comes out with something which he views as a wrong thing or an un-Islamic thing, which now becomes binding upon us. So this is seriously problematic. Let's say that they make an announcement that no Muslims should actually go to a certain concert and say that it's haram for them to attend concert. That becomes legally binding if you go by the MuftiBill. So this is seriously a problem.
Well, let's return to Indonesia. New President PrabowoSubianto has sworn in a mega-sized cabinet. It's the largest the country has seen since 1966. Max Walden, reporter for ABC's Asia Pacific newsroom, joins us in the studio to tell us more. Now, Max, tell us a bit more about why this cabinet is so big, and is it going to be really expensive?
Well, it's been described as the compromise cabinet. So there's lots of people in there that the new President Prabowo would like to see in there. However, I think, you know, the general mood is that there's many people who've sort of been retained that are affiliated with the Jokowi camp, who, of course, helped Prabowo into power. It's also noteworthy that there's only a couple of parties that don't have any representation. So the opposition, even not just in the parliament, but within the cabinet itself, is fairly minimal. But the budget's going to remain the same. So in terms of, it was described to me by one analyst that essentially these 109 ministers and heads of agencies will be fighting over scraps, like the remaining budget.
Oh dear. Does it come as any surprise that Prabowo has chosen to retain a long-serving finance minister? Not too surprising, given that Sri Mulyani Indrawati is a highly technocratic, very well-credentialed person. She was previously managing director of the World Bank, and as you mentioned, long-serving as finance minister. She's, of course, you know, affiliated with the Jokowi governments. There are several figures like her, but I think it's probably also worth mentioning that she's only one of 5 women out of that 109 cabinet members, and whilst the cabinet size is almost doubled, the number of women is about half. So I think that's probably to some extent reflective of the makeup of this cabinet. There's quite a few sort of military figures in there, but as mentioned, it's sort of very much a compromise cabinet. So Prabowo has brought in a lot of people that you would assume to be kind of natural, I suppose, opponents. Lots of human rights figures, for example. The new human rights minister is ethnic Papuan. So I think it's a very clever move by him. But again, managing that expense of all of those people is what remains to be seen. Max, thanks for coming in.
Thanks, Yvonne.
Tokyo Metro has been publicly listed on the stock market in Japan's largest IPO in 6 years. The shares shot up 45% in their market debut and closed that day with a value of roughly 9.8 billion Australian dollars. The company carries more than 6 million passengers daily. A court in Greenland has again extended the detention of prominent anti-whaling campaigner Paul Watson. Hundreds of protesters gathered in Paris in support of Mr. Watson, who's been in custody since July, while Denmark considers a Japanese extradition request. The founder of the SeaShepherd conservation group has been wanted in Japan since 2010 for allegedly obstructing and breaking into a Japanese whaling ship. Mr. Watson has reportedly asked for political asylum from the French President Emmanuel Macron. A zoo in Thailand has banned slingshots after a tourist was filmed using one inside the zoo. A complaint has been filed to local police as it was unclear what the tourist was aiming at and whether any animals had been hurt. Khao Keo Open Zoo, south of Bangkok, is best known as the home of internet sensation MooDeng. Since the baby pygmy hippo rose to fame on TikTok, the zoo has experienced a surge in visitors. And in a Hong Kong zoo, 12 monkeys have died. A bacterial infection called melioidosis killed at least 11 monkeys and is suspected to have caused another death later this week. An autopsy revealed the bacteria likely came from soil near their enclosure. Officials say it's unlikely that the animals would pass the infections on to humans.
Melioidosis infection is through contact with contaminated soil and surface waters, but not person to person or animal to person.
Home to award-winning coffee roasters and baristas, there are incredible cafes to be found on nearly every block in Taipei. Ilham Isaac spoke to the people establishing coffee as an integral part of Taiwan's culture.
Taiwan, long known for its iconic bubble tea, has a newfound love for coffee. Don't get me wrong, people walking on the street with a bubble tea in their hands is still the norm here in Taipei. But coffee shops are also simply everywhere. Just walking down the street for about 200 meters, I passed like 8 coffee shops. And that's not even counting convenience stores on every street corner that also offers freshly roasted specialty coffee. According to the latest figures published by Ministry of Economic Affairs, in 2022, there were more than 4,000 coffee shops in Taiwan, an increase of 160% compared to 11 years ago. It's not just the ubiquity that is impressive about Taiwan's coffee scene, it's the quality too. This shop is owned by a world's coffee roasting champion. This shop is owned by a World Brewers Cup champion. This one by a Nordic roaster champion. And this one by the first and only Taiwanese to win the prestigious title of World Barista Champion.
你好，在精品咖啡圈子里面，那个时候大家还并不会把台湾当成是一个强国，咖啡的强国，而是直到2016年我拿下 WBC 的冠军之后，大家才会认为哇，台湾是一个真正的咖啡强国。所以从那个时候开始，很明显的就是，会有很多东南亚的旅客，他们是为了好咖啡店而来到台湾。
Berg told me that he studied engineering in college, so naturally he would bring this engineering mindset into the coffee making process.
特别准备了3支不同水温的手冲壶，所以在冲一杯咖啡的时候，我们会依照不同的阶段，然后咖啡所冲出来不同的效果，去决定那一个阶段要用什么样的水温。
Taiwan's coffee culture dates back to its colonial days under Japan. By the early 20th century, Japan had already developed a taste for coffee during the Meiji period and later introduced coffee plantations and shops to Taiwan.
就是我 grandma 那一代的，开始就是有接收到非常多日本的咖啡文化，所以以前我小时候看到最多的是 sidelines， 所以台湾人对喝黑咖啡的习惯是。早就已经有养成了。
Made with premium local beans in the most intricate process I've ever witnessed, that cup of coffee set me back about 23 Australian dollars. But that's the thing about Taiwanese coffee scene. While top-tier coffee is available for those willing to pay for it, great, affordable options are also easily found everywhere. Like this one. About a decade ago, Luo Jianqiang decided to quit his long-held job in search of his true passion. He ended up opening this small coffee shop with his wife.
那星期一到星期五都是这上班族的人来这边消费。那礼拜六的话，就有我们听障朋友会来这边。应该是很多客人来，他第一次来很好奇，哦，原来这边是听障的，哦，不能讲话的。然后我告诉他说：“不好意思，你讲话我听不懂，不好意思，我没有办法听。”他们才发现，他们才知道这里哦，原来用点餐的方式。那慢慢他们熟了，回客率就很高。
Like many other coffee shops in Taiwan, Luo Jianqiang insists on roasting his own beans right here in the shop. He believes that this is the best way to service the community that he cultivated over the years.
很早在创立之前，我要先去练习，我去向咖啡老师学习。然后很多他的朋友都是当咖啡师的，我就问他们来评估，来给我一些意见跟反馈，慢慢的抓到我自己想要的。那这个样子的话，就是英文的 I， 英文的 L love， 英文的 Y U， 所以合起来就是 I love you。
有一个很有趣的现象，台湾的精品咖啡很多之外，台湾自家烘焙的精品咖啡店就是比例非常高。那甚至很多咖啡的玩家，他们自己在家里面就会自己烘焙豆子。我觉得这个跟民族性有非常大的关系。台湾人在饮食方面是非常具有包容度的，然后非常愿意接收新的知识。 然后也非常愿意自己投入下去钻研看看。
Ilham Isaac, ABC News, Taipei.
They sure are dedicated to their craft. Well, that's all we have time for. I'll see you next time. Bye for now.